Welcome back to Report of Silver. Today we are diving into a topic that most investors are not paying enough attention to, but they absolutely should be, because this is one of the hidden demand drivers in the silver market that could have major long-term consequences. Most people think about silver as coins, bars, jewelry, or maybe industrial demand from solar panels and electric vehicles. But there is another category of demand that rarely gets discussed publicly, and that is military demand. Silver is not just sitting quietly in vaults or coin shops waiting to be traded. It is being consumed every single day in some of the most advanced military systems on Earth. And once that silver is used, much of it never returns to the market. It is burned, destroyed, dispersed, and effectively removed from the global supply chain forever. That changes the way we need to think about this metal.
Before we jump in, make sure you subscribe to Report of Silver because we cover gold and silver every single day, breaking down the stories that matter most to investors, stackers, and anyone trying to understand where this market is really heading. If you care about preserving wealth, understanding the silver supply story, and staying ahead of major market developments, this is the channel for you. Now let's get into it. Silver is one of the most strategically important metals in the world, but most people still view it as a simple precious metal. That is a mistake. Silver is not just money, it is also technology, it is energy, it is medicine, and perhaps most importantly, it is defense. Silver has the highest electrical conductivity of any metal on Earth. It has extraordinary thermal properties, anti-corrosive qualities, and unmatched reliability in high-performance systems. That is exactly why militaries around the world depend on it. Think about what modern warfare looks like today. It is no longer just tanks and boots on the ground. It is missiles, drones, satellites, radar systems, communication networks, advanced targeting systems, aircraft electronics, naval defense platforms, and increasingly autonomous weapons. Every one of those systems depends on highly specialized components, and many of those components require silver. Not because it is convenient, but because there is often no better substitute. This is where the story becomes important for silver investors. When silver is used in coins or bars, it remains above ground. It can be resold, melted down, recycled, and brought back into circulation. But military silver does not work that way. When silver goes into a missile and that missile is launched, that silver is gone. When it goes into a drone that gets destroyed in combat, it is gone. When it is embedded in advanced military electronics exposed to battlefield conditions, it often becomes economically unrecoverable. That means this is destruction demand, not recyclable demand. That distinction matters because the silver market is already tight. According to multiple industry reports, silver has been running structural deficits for years. In simple terms, the world is consuming more silver than it is producing. Above-ground inventories are being drawn down. Industrial demand remains strong, and investment demand continues to rise whenever economic uncertainty increases. Now add military demand to that equation, and suddenly the supply picture becomes even more serious. One of the biggest problems is that military silver usage is difficult to quantify. Governments do not openly report how much silver they consume in defense applications. In the United States, detailed reporting from the Department of Defense largely stopped decades ago. The result is that analysts are forced to estimate. That means many numbers circulating online may be exaggerated, underestimated, or simply impossible to verify. But the absence of exact data does not mean the demand is small. In fact, it may mean the opposite. This is why some analysts argue that military demand is one of the most overlooked factors in the silver market. It is hidden demand. It does not show up clearly in many annual reports. It does not make headlines. But it exists, and it matters. If silver is required to maintain military readiness, then governments are not going to treat it like a luxury commodity. They are going to treat it like a strategic asset. That changes the conversation completely. Instead of asking, how much is silver worth today? The more important question becomes, how much silver must governments secure regardless of price? That is a very different market dynamic. If military planners need silver for defense systems, they are not going to stop buying because the price goes up $5 or $10. They will pay what they need to pay because national security is not optional. This is why many long-term silver investors believe the market is misunderstood. The average investor sees silver as a commodity price chart. Governments may see it as a strategic necessity. Those are two very different lenses, and eventually those two realities can collide. When they do, price can move very quickly. That is the foundation of today's discussion. Silver is not just an investment metal. It may be one of the most strategically important materials in the modern world, and the military demand story could be far bigger than most people realize. To understand why military demand matters so much, we first need to understand how silver is actually used inside modern defense systems. Many people hear the phrase silver is used in missiles and assume that means a tiny amount, something insignificant. But when you scale that across entire military inventories, global conflicts, weapons testing, routine maintenance, and strategic stockpiling, the numbers begin to look much larger. More importantly, unlike silver used in consumer goods, much of this silver is effectively destroyed once deployed. Take missiles as an example. Advanced missile systems such as cruise missiles, interceptors, and precision-guided munitions depend on extremely sophisticated electronics. These systems contain navigation hardware, onboard computers, guidance controls, sensors, wiring systems, and communication modules. Silver is often used in electrical contacts, circuit pathways, soldering materials, and conductive coatings because failure is not an option. In a smartphone, if something fails, it is an inconvenience. In a missile system, failure could mean mission failure or loss of life. That is why the military prioritizes reliability over cost, and silver provides that reliability. The same is true for drones. Drones are becoming one of the defining technologies of modern warfare. They are cheaper, faster to produce, and increasingly more important on the battlefield than many traditional weapon systems. But every drone contains electronics, batteries, sensors, and communication equipment. All of that requires conductive materials, and silver plays an important role. The world is producing and destroying drones at a pace never seen before, and each one represents another layer of silver demand that is rarely discussed. Then there are satellites. Military satellites are some of the most advanced technological systems humans have ever built. They support navigation, communication, missile detection, battlefield intelligence, and strategic defense coordination. Silver is used in solar contacts, electronics, shielding systems, and other critical components. Once that silver is launched into orbit, it is permanently removed from the market. Nobody is recycling military satellites in space. The same logic applies to fighter jets, submarines, tanks, radar systems, and naval vessels. These platforms are loaded with advanced electrical systems. Radar arrays, communication systems, thermal imaging, electronic warfare tools, and targeting systems all depend on highly conductive materials. Silver helps make those systems function under extreme temperatures, pressure, vibration, and battlefield stress. What makes this even more important is that the silver inside military systems often cannot be economically recovered. A missile detonates, and that silver is vaporized or scattered. A drone crashes, and the components are destroyed. Battlefield electronics become damaged beyond recovery. Even when recovery is theoretically possible, the cost of extracting tiny amounts of silver from damaged military hardware usually makes no financial sense. That means the silver is effectively gone forever. This is very different from something like jewelry or silverware, where the metal can be melted and reused. Military silver behaves more like fuel. It gets consumed, it disappears. That is why some analysts call it destruction demand. It is not temporary demand. It is permanent removal from supply. Now think about current global conditions. Multiple conflicts are happening at the same time. Nations are increasing defense budgets. Weapons stockpiles are being replenished. Military contractors are receiving larger orders. Governments are openly discussing strategic supply chains and critical minerals. Every one of those developments points toward higher material demand, including silver. At the same time, silver mining is not something that can be rapidly expanded overnight. New mines take years to permit, finance, and develop. Existing mines face declining ore grades, rising costs, and political risks. That means if military demand increases unexpectedly, supply cannot simply adjust immediately. This creates stress in the system. And remember, military demand does not care about silver's spot price. If a government needs missiles, satellites, and defense electronics, it will buy the silver required to build them. National security budgets do not stop because silver rises from $35 to $50 or even $100. That demand becomes price insensitive, which is extremely important for understanding future market dynamics. This is why the military silver story matters so much. It is not just about how much silver is used in one missile or one drone. It is about the broader reality that modern warfare consumes strategic metals at an enormous scale, and silver is one of the most critical among them. Every new conflict, every weapons contract, and every defense expansion quietly adds pressure to an already tight silver market. One of the biggest reasons the military silver story remains misunderstood is because there is almost no official transparency around it. Investors can track silver mine production. They can track exchange inventories like COMEX and LBMA. They can monitor ETF flows, industrial demand estimates, and retail coin sales. But when it comes to military consumption, much of that information simply disappears behind government secrecy. That creates a major blind spot in the market. Decades ago, governments used to provide more detailed reporting on strategic metals. Over time, much of that transparency faded. Defense departments stopped publicly breaking down exact materials consumption. Military contractors became less specific. Strategic stockpile data became harder to interpret. Today, analysts are often left using estimates, historical references, engineering assumptions, and scattered defense industry reports to piece together what might actually be happening. That is why you often see wildly different numbers online. One source may claim a cruise missile uses hundreds of ounces of silver. Another source may say it uses only a fraction of that. One analyst may argue military demand is relatively small. Another may argue it is massive and heavily understated. The truth is, nobody outside classified systems knows the exact number, and that uncertainty itself is important. Some people look at that uncertainty and say, well, if we cannot prove it exactly, maybe it does not matter. That is the wrong conclusion. In markets, uncertainty often creates underpricing. If something important is hard to measure, investors tend to ignore it. That does not mean it is small, it means it is hidden. Think about the annual silver reports that most investors rely on. They usually break silver demand into categories like jewelry, silverware, industrial use, photography, and investment demand. Industrial use might include electronics, solar, medical devices, and automotive applications. But military and aerospace are often buried inside broader industrial categories or omitted as standalone categories entirely. That means many investors are reading demand reports without realizing an important piece may be missing. Now imagine what that means during periods of military escalation. If governments suddenly increase missile production, replenish strategic reserves, or expand defense manufacturing, that silver demand may not show up clearly in public reports for months or years, if ever. Yet the physical metal is still being consumed. It is still leaving the available market. It is still tightening supply. This becomes even more important when you remember that governments do not just consume silver, they can also stockpile it. If military planners believe silver is essential for future readiness, they may decide to secure supply before shortages become obvious. That means governments could quietly compete with private investors, manufacturers, and bullion buyers for the same ounces. That is a completely different market dynamic than most people imagine. Retail investors often think they are competing with other stackers. Maybe some institutions, maybe jewelry manufacturers. But what if they are also indirectly competing with defense supply chains and strategic procurement departments? That changes the picture entirely. History gives us a reason to take this seriously. Governments have always treated critical materials differently during times of stress. Oil has strategic reserves. Rare earth elements are treated as geopolitical assets. Uranium is tightly controlled. Food supply chains are protected. Why would silver be any different if it is essential to advanced military systems? In fact, some analysts argue that silver may be one of the most underappreciated strategic materials in the world because it sits at the intersection of defense, energy, and technology. It is needed for missiles and radar systems. It is needed for solar panels and electrical grids. It is needed for electric vehicles and next-generation batteries. It is needed for medical systems and advanced electronics. That means multiple sectors are all competing for the same metal, and yet the public conversation usually focuses only on price charts. Is silver up today? Is silver down this week? Will it break resistance? Those are short-term questions. The deeper question is whether the world is slowly waking up to the strategic importance of silver. If that realization spreads, it could reshape how governments, institutions, and investors behave. Silver may stop being viewed primarily as a commodity and start being viewed more like a strategic resource. Once that mindset changes, markets can move very quickly because the motivation for buying changes. It is no longer just about profit. It becomes about access and security. That is why transparency matters so much. The lack of clear military data does not weaken the silver thesis. In many ways, it strengthens it because it suggests there may be a layer of demand the market is not fully pricing in. Investors hate unknowns, but sometimes the unknown is exactly where opportunity hides. Once you connect hidden military demand to the broader silver market, the supply picture starts to look much tighter than many investors realize. This is where the silver story becomes far more serious. For years, the market has already been operating in what analysts call a structural deficit. That simply means the world is using more silver than it is producing. Mine supply plus recycling has not been enough to meet total demand, and that gap has been filled by drawing down above-ground inventories. In other words, the market has been living off stored silver. At first glance, that may not sound alarming. People hear that there are still hundreds of millions of ounces sitting in vaults and assume there is plenty of silver available. But that assumption can be misleading. Not all silver inventories are equally available. Some of that metal belongs to long-term investors who have no intention of selling. Some of it is tied up in industrial supply chains. Some is held by sovereign institutions. Some is committed to exchange systems. And some of it may already be strategically reserved in ways the public cannot easily see. That means the amount of truly available silver could be much smaller than headline numbers suggest. This is exactly why investors watch inventory movements so closely. When large exchanges show consistent withdrawals, that tells you physical metal is leaving the system. It may not mean an immediate shortage, but it does suggest tightening conditions. Now layer military demand on top of that. Even if defense-related silver consumption is smaller than some of the more aggressive estimates circulating online, it still matters because the silver is effectively removed from the supply chain permanently. Unlike bullion that can re-enter the market, military silver often disappears forever. That creates a one-way flow out of the market. At the same time, industrial demand continues expanding. Solar remains one of the largest growth sectors for silver consumption. Global solar installations continue increasing because governments are aggressively pushing energy transitions. Every new solar panel requires silver. Electric vehicles are another growing source of demand. While some exaggerated claims suggest extremely high silver content per vehicle, even conservative estimates show EVs use more silver than traditional vehicles due to electronics, power systems, and battery components. Then there is consumer electronics. Smartphones, laptops, medical devices, 5G infrastructure, artificial intelligence hardware, and advanced semiconductors all depend on silver's unmatched conductivity. This demand does not stop during economic slowdowns. In many cases, it accelerates. So now imagine the full picture. You have industrial demand rising. Investment demand spikes whenever inflation fears or financial instability increase. Central banks around the world are aggressively accumulating hard assets, even if their primary focus is gold. Governments are expanding military budgets. Defense contractors are increasing production. Strategic competition between major powers is intensifying, and all of it points back to one physical reality. More sectors want more silver, but mine supply is not responding fast enough. Silver production is difficult because much of the world's silver is produced as a byproduct of mining other metals like copper, lead, and zinc. That means silver output often depends on decisions unrelated to silver prices. Even if silver doubles in price, it does not guarantee a doubling of production. The mining system simply does not work that way. This creates a dangerous imbalance. If demand keeps rising while supply remains constrained, eventually something has to adjust. Either demand gets destroyed through higher prices, or inventories continue falling until the market reaches a breaking point. Historically, commodities can ignore these imbalances for long periods, and then suddenly reprice very aggressively. That is what many long-term silver investors are watching. They are not focused only on whether silver moves $1 next week. They are watching the foundation underneath the market. They are asking whether the physical market is becoming tighter year after year. And increasingly, the evidence suggests it is. Now add one more factor: psychology. Most investors still do not understand this story. They are focused on short-term volatility. They hear silver dropped 5% and assume the story has changed. But physical supply fundamentals do not change overnight. In many cases, falling prices during tight supply conditions simply create opportunities for stronger hands to accumulate more metal. That is why many stackers continue buying, regardless of short-term price swings. They believe the market is underestimating long-term scarcity. If they are right, today's prices may look cheap in hindsight. When you step back and look at the full picture, the silver story becomes much bigger than most people realize. This is not just a story about coins, bars, or short-term price action. It is not just a story about inflation hedging or portfolio diversification. Silver is increasingly becoming a strategic metal, and that changes everything. It sits at the center of multiple global trends all happening at the same time: military expansion, technological advancement, energy transformation, and rising geopolitical tension. That is a very powerful combination. For decades, silver has been treated by much of the financial world as an afterthought. Gold has always received more attention. Central banks openly buy gold. Financial media constantly talks about gold. Investors instinctively understand gold's monetary role. But silver has quietly built a different kind of importance. It may not be the primary reserve asset, but it has become essential to the systems that power the modern world. Without silver, many of the technologies we depend on simply do not function the same way. That includes national defense. And once a metal becomes tied to national security, governments begin looking at it differently. They stop thinking like traders and start thinking like strategists. The question becomes less about price and more about access. Can we secure enough supply? Can we guarantee future availability? Can we protect supply chains in a crisis? Those are not normal commodity market questions. Those are strategic planning questions. That is why this military demand story matters, even if some of the exact numbers remain uncertain. The point is not whether one missile contains 10 ounces or 50 ounces or more. The point is that silver is essential, and once it enters that military pipeline, much of it never comes back. It becomes part of a one-way consumption system. Over time, that matters. And remember, military demand is only one piece of the puzzle. Solar demand continues rising. Electric vehicles continue expanding. Electronics continue becoming more advanced. Artificial intelligence infrastructure requires enormous hardware investment. Medical technology keeps growing. Every major technological trend seems to require more silver, not less. That creates an uncomfortable reality for the supply side. The world cannot simply invent more silver overnight. Mines take years to develop. Recycling helps, but it cannot solve the problem alone. Above-ground inventories may look large on paper, but available supply can tighten very quickly when multiple sectors compete for the same metal. This is why many long-term silver investors remain patient. They understand that markets can stay disconnected from fundamentals for a long time. Price does not always reflect reality in the short term, but eventually physical supply and demand matter. Eventually, shortages become visible. Eventually, strategic buying changes the market, and when that moment arrives, it often happens faster than people expect. Markets rarely move in a straight line. They stay quiet, sometimes frustratingly quiet, until suddenly they do not. By the time the mainstream media starts talking about a silver shortage, the move may already be well underway. For investors, the takeaway is simple. Silver may deserve more respect than it currently receives. It is not just a speculative trade. It is not just an industrial metal. It may be one of the most strategically important resources of the modern era. That does not guarantee higher prices tomorrow, but it does strengthen the long-term investment case. For governments, the lesson is even clearer. If silver supports military readiness, energy systems, and technological competitiveness, then securing supply becomes a matter of national resilience. That could lead to more stockpiling, more domestic mining incentives, and greater competition for physical metal in the years ahead. And for stackers, this reinforces why so many continue accumulating ounces month after month. Not because they expect instant gains, but because they understand scarcity. They understand that owning physical silver is not just about speculation. It is about holding something tangible, finite, and increasingly essential. The world may still be pricing silver like a commodity, but the reality may be very different. It may be a strategic asset hiding in plain sight. And if that is true, then every ounce matters more than most people realize. That is why I believe silver's story is only getting started. Keep watching the supply data. Keep watching military spending. Keep watching industrial demand. Most importantly, keep paying attention to the physical market because that is where the real story is written. If you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe to Report of Silver for daily gold and silver coverage. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and let me know your thoughts below. Do you believe military demand is one of the missing pieces of the silver puzzle? I would love to hear your perspective. Until next time, keep stacking, stay informed, and protect your wealth. Peace.